Right, so Rachel Reeves has just called Nigel Farage a racist on live television. And honestly, that is the kind of statement that makes every politician in Westminster reach for their phone to see if they missed something absolutely massive. But here is the thing. This entire row has become so spectacularly messy, so laden with contradictions, and so perfectly emblematic of modern British politics that you absolutely need to understand what is actually happening beneath all the noise and fury. Quick favor, if you are loving this kind of political theatre, hit that subscribe button. Over 94% of viewers have not yet, and it is completely free. Takes a second and means the world to us. Thanks so much. If you did subscribe already, brilliant. Now let us crack on with what might be the most fascinating welfare row in recent memory. So, let us set the scene. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has decided that scrapping the two-child benefit cap is going to be Labour's big welfare move. Now, for those who might not be entirely familiar with what this cap actually does, let me break it down. The two-child limit means that families receive child benefit for their first two children, but if they have a third child, that third child does not get the benefit. It is, quite literally, a policy that says the government will help you with two kids, but after that, you're on your own. It was introduced by the Conservatives, and it has been an absolutely controversial policy from day one. Labour is now removing it, which means money will flow to around 450,000 children, potentially lifting them out of poverty by 2030. That's the big promise. That's the headline. And naturally, because this is British politics, everyone has immediately started arguing about exactly what this means, who it helps, and whether it is a good idea or an absolute disaster masquerading as compassion. Now, here is where Nigel Farage entered the chat, and this is where things got properly spicy. Farage came out and warned that Labour's policy means money for huge numbers of foreign-born people. That's the quote that has set absolutely everything on fire. He's essentially saying that because the policy does not discriminate based on where a person was born, it will benefit people who were not born in Britain, and that, he seems to suggest, is somehow problematic. This is where Rachel Reeves completely lost her patience, and honestly, you can almost understand why. Reeves essentially responded by painting a picture that is absolutely brutal in its clarity. She asked, does Nigel Farage want to go around and say, white, yeah, you can have the money, black, no, sorry, it's not for you? She then gave this incredibly specific example of a hypothetical mum who works in the National Health Service, who's lived here all her life, whose kids have lived here all their life, but who was born somewhere else. Under Farage's logic, that family would be denied the benefit, whilst a family next door who is British-born would get it. And Reeves said, quite bluntly, that makes her angry. That's not the sort of country she believes in. Fair point, really. The analogy cuts through all the noise and gets to the absolute heart of what Farage seems to be suggesting. She then went even further and suggested to The Guardian that Farage's comments were, by her assessment, racist. Not dog whistle racism, not problematic, not insensitive, racist. She said, I don't really care what colour a kid's skin is. Some deserve to be in poverty and some do not. That makes me pretty angry. Now that's a statement that puts down a marker. That's Reeves saying she's willing to use that word, willing to make that accusation, and frankly, willing to own it. Now, naturally, Reform absolutely hit back, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the counter-argument is where we start to see the cracks in the logical foundation of what Reeves is saying. Zia Youssef, Reform's policy chief, came out swinging and accused Reeves of ethno-nationalism. He posted on X, and pay attention to this because it's actually quite clever, he said that Reeves was essentially saying only white people can be British. He's turning her argument around and saying that by suggesting his comments are racist, she's the one making this about race and ethnicity rather than citizenship and residency. Think about that for a moment, because here's where the debate actually gets complicated. Farage is not saying we should only help white people. What he's actually saying, and this is the distinction that matters, is we should only help British families. Now, that's still a policy position you might strongly disagree with, but it's technically different from racism. It's about citizenship and residency, not skin color. It's a policy argument, not a racial one. Reeves has essentially accused him of racism by reading a racial motivation into a citizenship argument, and Yusuf is clever enough to flip that back and say you're the one making this about race by suggesting that foreign-born is code for non-white. And here's the genuinely uncomfortable bit, because both of them have got a point. Farage's comment about huge numbers of foreign-born people does carry uncomfortable implications about who he thinks should and should not get state support. That's worth criticizing, but Reeves is perhaps being a bit aggressive in immediately jumping to the racism accusation rather than engaging with the underlying policy argument. It's like they're talking past each other, both partially right and partially wrong, and the entire thing becomes an absolute mess. Let's talk about the actual policy now, because beyond the name-calling, there's a genuinely interesting debate happening here. Out of the 470,000 households affected by the two-child cap, only 3,700 have two adults working full-time. That's less than 0.8% of the total. Let me say that again because it's genuinely mind-blowing. Less than 1% of the families affected would actually qualify for Farage's revised version of the policy, which he says would only benefit families where both parents work full-time. So his entire policy would help almost nobody. It's a policy that sounds strict but is functionally useless. That's worth pointing out, and frankly, Reeves should have gone for that angle rather than immediately reaching for the racism card. Work and Pensions Secretary John McFadden has been touring the broadcast studios defending the cost of this policy, and fair play to him, he's actually making some solid points. He's framing this not just as a cash transfer, but as an investment in children's futures. And statistically, he's got evidence on his side. Children from the poorest families perform worse at school, are less likely to achieve 5 good GCSEs, and significantly more likely to experience mental health problems later in life. There's actual research backing up the argument that poverty in childhood has genuine, measurable consequences. That's a good argument, and it's an argument that actually stands on its own without needing to accuse Farage of racism. But here's where Labour has essentially shot itself in the foot, because the party has just levied £30 billion of tax increases in the budget, at the same time that they're spending an additional £16 billion a year on welfare. They're raising taxes on working people. Conservative Shadow Chancellor Sir Mel Stride is right when he says this approach is contradictory. You can't simultaneously claim to care about economic growth and then raise taxes whilst increasing welfare spending. The two things are working against each other. And Kemi Badenoch was not wrong when she branded the entire package a budget for Benefit Street paid for by working people. This is the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Labour particularly wants to discuss. The two-child benefit cap is undoubtedly a cruel policy that affects the most vulnerable children in Britain. Scrapping it is a defensible position, but doing it whilst also breaking manifesto pledges on tax by imposing £30 billion of increases is frankly politically indefensible. You're asking working people to pay more tax whilst the state supports more welfare. That's not a sustainable political message, and it's certainly not something you can sell by just accusing your critics of racism. What makes this entire saga genuinely fascinating is that it reveals the absolute chaos underneath modern British politics. We've got Farage making a policy argument that has uncomfortable undertones. We've got Reeves reading a racial motivation into a citizenship argument. We've got Reform proposing a policy that would help less than 1% of affected families. We've got Labour claiming to care about child poverty whilst simultaneously raising taxes on working people. And Conservatives pretending they have some kind of principled alternative whilst having created the policy in the first place. Everybody involved in this debate is simultaneously right and wrong, which is exactly the kind of political gridlock that Britain has found itself in. The two-child benefit cap is genuinely problematic. Scrapping it is a reasonable policy response, but paying for it through tax rises whilst claiming to support growth is frankly contradictory nonsense.
Farage's position is technically not racist, but it does feel like it's coming from a place of skepticism about immigration, and Reeves using the racism accusation rather than engaging with the actual policy argument is politically savvy but intellectually lazy. The real conversation we should be having is how Britain structures its welfare system, how we make sure child poverty is tackled, and how we pay for it in a way that actually makes sense economically. Instead, we're having a row about whether Farage is a racist and whether Reeves cares about working people. The substance has disappeared, replaced entirely by theatre and outrage, which is exactly what modern British politics does best. And frankly, that's the real scandal here. Not Farage's comments, not Reeves' response, but the fact that we've completely lost the ability to have a serious policy discussion about something that actually matters to millions of families across Britain. Thank you so much for watching. We genuinely appreciate it.